There exists a form of execution so horrifying that its very description challenges the boundaries of human imagination. This was not merely death. It was the systematic destruction of both body and soul, designed to break a person completely before they drew their final breath. For centuries, the Kingdom of England perfected a method of execution that stands as one of the darkest achievements in the history of human cruelty. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was to experience 3 deaths in one, each more excruciating than the last. This was the ultimate punishment reserved for those accused of high treason, and it was meant to serve as a warning carved into flesh and bone. What you are about to discover is not simply history, it is a journey into the heart of state-sanctioned terror, where justice twisted into spectacle and death became theater. The condemned were forced to witness their own dismemberment, to smell their own burning organs, to feel the ultimate violation of self. This is the story of a punishment so brutal that even in an age of violence, it stood apart. The origins of this barbaric practice trace back to medieval England, a time when the concept of treason carried a weight beyond modern comprehension. In the 13th century, to betray the crown was not simply a political crime, but an offense against God himself, for the monarch was believed to rule by divine right. The first recorded victim was William de Morisco in 1242, a pirate whose crimes against the realm earned him this unprecedented fate. But it was in 1283 that the punishment became codified into law, when Prince Dafydd ap Gruffydd of Wales, the last native Prince of Wales, was subjected to this ritualized horror after his capture by King Edward III. The execution was carefully designed, each stage symbolic of the various crimes attributed to treason. Drawing represented the traitor being dragged through the dirt like an animal. Hanging signified the theft of life they had plotted against their sovereign. Disembowelment was the exposure of their inner treachery. Beheading ended their ability to think treasonous thoughts. Quartering scattered their remains as they had sought to scatter the kingdom. This was not spontaneous cruelty, but calculated symbolism. The legal framework that governed this execution was established under the Treason Act of 1351 during the reign of King Edward III. This statute defined high treason with chilling precision, conspiring the death of the king, making war against the sovereign, or giving aid to the king's enemies. The punishment was equally precise in its horror. The formal sentence pronounced upon the condemned read with bureaucratic coldness, that you be drawn on a hurdle to the place of execution, where you shall be hanged by the neck, and being alive cut down. Your privy members shall be cut off, and your bowels taken out and burned before you. Your head severed from your body, and your body divided into 4 quarters, to be disposed of at the king's pleasure. These were not empty words, but a promise of agony to come. The sentence remained on England's statute books for more than 5 centuries, a testament to the endurance of institutional cruelty. Women convicted of high treason were spared this particular horror, not out of mercy, but out of concern for public decency. Instead, they were burned at the stake, another form of execution that prioritized spectacle over swift death. The gendered nature of these punishments reveals much about medieval society's view of the body and its violation. The social and political context of medieval and early modern England made such extreme punishment not only possible, but necessary in the eyes of those in power. The monarchy existed in a perpetual state of vulnerability, surrounded by nobles who commanded their own armies and harbored their own ambitions. Religious conflict added another layer of danger, particularly during the Tudor and Stuart periods, when Catholic and Protestant factions battled for supremacy. The Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators attempted to blow up Parliament, exemplified the existential threats faced by the Crown. Every monarch understood that their grip on power was only as strong as the fear they could instill in potential traitors. Public execution was not simply punishment, but propaganda, a visceral demonstration that the king's justice was absolute and inescapable. The elaborate nature of hanging, drawing, and quartering served to maximize this propaganda value. It was not enough for traitors to die. They had to die in a way that would be remembered, discussed, and feared, by all who heard the tale. The execution day began not at the scaffold, but in the darkness of the prison cell, where the condemned man would have spent his final night contemplating the horror that awaited him. Some prisoners were tortured beforehand to extract confessions or the names of co-conspirators, their bodies already broken before the formal punishment began. Guy Fawkes, for instance, spent days on the rack, a device that slowly pulled limbs from their sockets, leaving him barely able to sign his own confession. On the morning of execution, the prisoner would be brought out into the daylight, already weakened by imprisonment, torture, and the psychological weight of knowing exactly what was about to happen to him. There was no mercy of ignorance, no comfort of uncertainty. Every condemned traitor knew the process in excruciating detail, for it had been performed countless times before and would be performed again. The ritual nature of the execution meant that tradition governed every moment, every action performed, according to established custom that had been refined over generations. The first stage, the drawing, was designed as a public humiliation that preceded the actual execution. The prisoner was tied to a wooden hurdle or frame, sometimes described as resembling a wicker sled, and bound securely so he could not escape or even sit upright. This hurdle was then attached to the back of a horse, and the condemned man was dragged through the streets from the prison to the place of execution. The route was deliberately chosen to pass through the most crowded areas of the city, ensuring maximum public exposure. The prisoner, lying flat on his back or stomach, would be pulled across cobblestones through mud and refuse, his body jolting with every movement of the horse. The journey could last for miles and take hours, depending on the distance from prison to gallows. During this time, the prisoner would already be suffering injuries from being dragged across rough surfaces, his skin scraped raw, bones bruised or broken from the constant impact. Crowds would line the streets to watch, some jeering and throwing refuse at the condemned man, others watching in silent horror or perhaps pity. This public parade served multiple purposes. It identified the prisoner to the population, demonstrated the power of royal justice, and began the process of degradation that would culminate in the execution itself. By the time the hurdle reached the place of execution, typically a permanent scaffold at sites like Tyburn in London, the prisoner would already be weakened and disoriented. The crowd that had followed or awaited the arrival would number in the thousands, sometimes tens of thousands, for particularly notorious cases. These were not quiet, respectful gatherings, but raucous events that mixed elements of carnival with judicial solemnity. Vendors sold food and drink, pickpockets worked the crowd, and people jostled for the best view of the scaffold. The execution site was carefully designed to accommodate these masses, with the gallows elevated so that all could witness the proceedings. The presence of such enormous crowds served the state's purpose of maximum intimidation, but it also created a volatile atmosphere where public sympathy could shift unpredictably. Some prisoners were granted a moment to address the crowd, a tradition that could backfire if the condemned man gave a stirring speech proclaiming his innocence or his cause. Others were denied even this final dignity, the noose placed around their neck before they could speak. The executioner, usually a professional who had performed this task many times before, would check his equipment and prepare for the careful timing that the execution required. The hanging portion of the punishment was perhaps the cruelest element, for it was designed specifically not to kill. In a standard hanging, the prisoner would drop from a height sufficient to break the neck, resulting in relatively quick death. But in this execution, the rope was shorter and the drop minimal, ensuring that the prisoner would strangle slowly without the mercy of a broken neck. The executioner's skill was crucial here, for he had to judge the exact moment to cut the prisoner down, keeping him alive for the horrors that followed. The prisoner would be left to hang, the noose tightening around his throat, cutting off air but not blood flow to the brain entirely. His face would turn purple, eyes bulging, tongue protruding as his body fought desperately for oxygen it could not obtain. The crowd would watch this agonizing strangulation, some counting the seconds, others looking away. After several minutes, when the prisoner was on the very edge of consciousness, when his body had gone limp and his struggles had ceased, the executioner would make his judgment and cut the rope. The prisoner would collapse to the scaffold, barely conscious, gasping for air that burned in his damaged throat, his mind clouded but not yet gone. This was the moment of greatest horror, for now the true punishment would begin. While the prisoner lay on the scaffold, struggling to breathe and barely conscious, the executioner and his assistants would work quickly. The prisoner's clothing would be torn away, exposing his body to the crowd. What happened next was the emasculation, the cutting away of the genitals, a symbolic and literal assault on the prisoner's manhood and dignity. This was done with the prisoner still alive, still capable of feeling, though whether he could fully comprehend what was happening is impossible to know. The severed parts would be thrown into a fire that had been prepared nearby, the flames consuming them while the prisoner watched or tried to watch through dimming eyes. Then came the disembowelment, the central horror of the entire execution. The executioner would make an incision in the prisoner's abdomen, a precise cut that opened the belly without immediately killing. The intestines and internal organs would be pulled from the body while the prisoner still lived, still breathed, still felt. Historical accounts describe victims who remained conscious through this process, some even speaking. One account from 1484 describes William Collingbourne, executed for writing a satirical poem about King Richard III, crying out, "O Lord Jesus, yet more trouble," as his heart was pulled from his chest. The organs would join the genitals in the fire, burning while the prisoner could still see and smell his own body being destroyed. The stench would have been overwhelming, a mix of burning flesh and the contents of the opened body. How long consciousness persisted through this process is unknown, but modern medical knowledge suggests that the shock and blood loss would eventually cause the brain to shut down, granting the mercy of unconsciousness, if not death. The beheading came next, though by this point the prisoner was almost certainly dead, or so close to death that the distinction was meaningless. The executioner would use an axe or sword to sever the head from the body, a task that could take multiple blows if the executioner was inexperienced or if the neck bones proved difficult to cut through. The head would be held aloft to the crowd, the traditional cry of "Behold the head of a traitor," announcing the completion of the judicial punishment. But the ritual was not yet finished. The quartering remained, the final stage of the process. The body would be cut into 4 parts, a task that required considerable strength and sharp tools to hack through bone and sinew. In some descriptions, the limbs were to be tied to 4 horses that would run in different directions, tearing the body apart. However, most historical evidence suggests this was a continental European practice, and that in England, the quartering was performed by the executioner with tools after death. The 4 quarters, along with the head, now became instruments of state propaganda. They would be parboiled in a mixture of salt and cumin to preserve them from immediate decay, then dispatched to different locations across the kingdom. The head would often be mounted on a pike on London Bridge or another prominent location, where it would remain for months or even years, slowly decaying into a skull. The quarters would be sent to various cities, displayed on gates or other public structures as a warning to all who saw them. The psychological impact of witnessing such an execution cannot be overstated. For the thousands who gathered to watch, the experience would have been profoundly traumatic, even in an age when death was far more visible than in our modern world. Children were brought to these events by their parents, the lesson of royal justice imprinted on young minds. The sights, sounds, and smells of the execution would linger in memory for a lifetime. The crowd's reaction was complex and variable. Some undoubtedly felt satisfaction at seeing a traitor punished, their loyalty to the crown reinforced by the spectacle. Others felt horror and pity, particularly if the condemned man was seen as sympathetic or if he died with dignity and courage. There are accounts of crowds falling silent during particularly gruesome moments, the carnival atmosphere evaporating in the face of extreme suffering. Some spectators fainted or became ill, others pushed closer, morbid fascination overcoming revulsion. The executioner himself was a figure of both fascination and revulsion, a man who performed society's darkest work. Some executioners became famous or infamous for their skill or their cruelty. They were paid for their services, both by the state and sometimes by the prisoners themselves or their families, who might pay for a cleaner execution, a quicker cut, a briefer suffering. The religious dimension of these executions added another layer of meaning to the proceedings. Many of those executed for treason were Catholic priests during the Elizabethan and Stuart periods, men who refused to acknowledge the monarch as head of the Church of England. For these victims, the execution was both martyrdom and persecution. Father John Houghton and his fellow Carthusian monks were hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1535 for refusing to accept King Henry VIII's supremacy over the Church. Oliver Plunkett, Archbishop of Armagh, suffered the same fate in 1681, the last Catholic to be executed for his faith in England. He was later canonized as a saint, his preserved head still venerated as a relic today. For these religious prisoners, the execution held a different meaning than for political traitors. They faced death not in despair, but in the hope of heavenly reward, their suffering transformed into spiritual triumph. Some reportedly prayed throughout their ordeal, forgiving their executioners and blessing the crowd. This could create a powerful counter-narrative to the state's intended message, transforming the execution from a demonstration of royal power into a testament to the strength of faith. The authorities were aware of this danger, which is why some prisoners were denied the opportunity to speak to the crowd, their potential martyrdom statements silenced by the noose. The most famous victims of hanging, drawing, and quartering were undoubtedly Guy Fawkes and his fellow conspirators in the Gunpowder Plot. On November 5, 1605, Fawkes was discovered in the cellars beneath Parliament with barrels of gunpowder, part of a Catholic conspiracy to blow up King James I and the entire government. The plot's failure led to the arrest and torture of Fawkes and his co-conspirators. They were tried in Westminster Hall in January 1606, their guilt never in doubt, and all were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The executions took place over 2 days, January 30th and 31. Sir Everard Digby, Thomas Bates, and Robert Winter died near St. Paul's Cathedral. The following day, Guy Fawkes, Ambrose Rookwood, Thomas Winter, and Robert Keyes were executed in the Old Palace Yard, directly in front of the building they had plotted to destroy. Fawkes, weakened by torture that had left him barely able to climb the scaffold ladder, reportedly jumped or fell from the gallows, breaking his neck and thus escaping the worst of the punishment. His companions were not so fortunate. The execution of the gunpowder plotters became one of the most remembered events in English history, commemorated annually on November 5th with bonfires and fireworks. The irony that Guy Fawkes' Night is celebrated with burning effigies and explosions reflects the complex legacy of these executions. Another notable victim was Sir William Wallace, the Scottish knight and leader of resistance against English rule. In 1305, after years of evading capture, Wallace was betrayed and brought to London for trial. He was denied the right to speak in his own defense, declared guilty of treason, and sentenced to the full punishment. Wallace was drawn through the streets of London to Smithfield, a journey of several miles, during which he was pelted with refuse by hostile crowds. At Smithfield, he was hanged, cut down while still alive, emasculated, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. His head was placed on a pike on London Bridge, where it remained for years. His 4 quarters were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, displayed in the 4 corners of the realm as a warning to other Scottish rebels. Wallace's execution did not have the intended effect of crushing Scottish resistance. Instead, it became a rallying point, transforming Wallace into a martyr and symbol of Scottish independence. The brutality of his death, rather than intimidating the Scots, inflamed their desire for freedom. This exemplifies the double-edged nature of such extreme punishment. While it demonstrated power, it could also generate sympathy for the victim and hatred for the executioner. The balance between terror and tyranny was a fine line that English monarchs did not always successfully navigate. The execution of Hugh Despenser the Younger in 1326 provides another window into the horror of this punishment. Despenser was the favorite of King Edward II, wielding enormous power and accumulating equally enormous resentment from the nobility. When Queen Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer led a rebellion against Edward II, Despenser was captured and subjected to a show trial. His execution was particularly brutal even by the standards of the time. He was stripped naked, and biblical verses condemning sodomy were written on his skin, a reference to rumors about his relationship with the king. He was then drawn through the streets of Hereford. At the scaffold, a crown of nettles was placed on his head in mockery of his power. He was hanged, but the rope broke, and he fell to the ground, still alive and conscious. The crowd apparently roared with excitement at this accident, which prolonged his suffering. He was then subjected to the full disembowelment and quartering while still alive. Historical accounts suggest he survived longer than most, remaining conscious through much of the ordeal. His head was sent to London, his quarters distributed to other cities. The savagery of Despenser's execution shocked even contemporaries accustomed to violence, suggesting that the punishment could be calibrated to be more or less brutal, depending on the victim and the political message the executioners wished to send. The mechanics of actually performing this execution required considerable skill and experience. The executioner was not simply a brute with an axe, but a specialist who understood anatomy, timing, and crowd management. He needed to know exactly how long to leave someone hanging before cutting them down, ensuring they remained alive but incapacitated. He needed to know where to cut to open the abdomen without immediately severing major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. He needed strength to pull organs from the body cavity and to hack through bone during the quartering. He needed to work quickly, both to complete the execution before the prisoner died naturally and to maintain the momentum of the spectacle. A slow, fumbling execution could turn the crowd against the executioner or even against the crown. Some executioners were better at this than others, and their reputations spread. A skilled executioner might be called upon to travel to different cities for particularly important executions. The tools of the trade were similarly specialized. Ropes of specific length and thickness, sharp knives for the emasculation and disembowelment, axes or swords for the beheading, cleavers and saws for the quartering. The fire needed to be the right size and temperature to burn organs quickly and completely. Every detail mattered in this carefully choreographed dance of death. The preservation and display of the body parts after execution was a science in itself. Simply leaving flesh exposed to the elements would result in rapid decay, which would defeat the purpose of long-term display. The practice of parboiling, simmering the severed parts in a cauldron of salted water mixed with cumin and other spices, served to partially cook and preserve the flesh. This process would have added another grotesque element to the execution day, with large cauldrons boiling near the scaffold and the smell of cooking human flesh mixing with the other odors of the spectacle. Once parboiled, the body parts could last for months or even years, slowly decaying but remaining recognizably human for much of that time. The heads on London Bridge became a famous feature of the city, visible to all who crossed the Thames. Foreign visitors commented on them in their journals, sometimes with horror, sometimes with admiration for the strictness of English justice. The bridgekeeper was responsible for maintaining the display, replacing spikes as they rotted, and keeping the heads secure against attempts by sympathizers to steal them for proper burial. In the various cities where quarters were sent, local authorities would erect them in prominent locations, on city gates, on the walls of castles, in market squares. These displays served as constant reminders of royal power and the fate of traitors. As the centuries passed, attitudes toward public execution began to shift, though change came slowly. The Enlightenment brought new ideas about justice, punishment, and human dignity. Thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued against torture and for proportional punishment. In England, reformers like William Wilberforce and Samuel Romilly pushed for changes to the brutal penal code. Public opinion, always a factor even in authoritarian times, began to turn against the most extreme forms of punishment. The last man to suffer the full punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering was David Tyree, a Scottish spy executed in Portsmouth in 1782. He was hanged for 23 minutes before being cut down and butchered. His execution, coming late in the Age of Enlightenment, was seen by many observers as a barbaric anachronism. In the following decades, the practice fell into disuse even before it was formally abolished. When Chartist rebels in 1839 were sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, there was such public outcry that the sentences were commuted to transportation to Australia. The Forfeiture Act of 1870 finally removed all reference to drawing and quartering from the statute books, ending nearly 6 centuries of legal authorization for this punishment. Simple hanging became the sole method of execution for treason, carried out in private rather than as public spectacle. The age of ritualized, spectacular execution was ending, replaced by the modern principle that punishment should be swift, certain, and private rather than prolonged, agonizing, and public. The abolition of hanging, drawing, and quartering did not erase its impact on the collective memory and culture of England and the wider world. The punishment became a symbol of medieval barbarity, invoked whenever people wished to illustrate the darkness of the past or the dangers of tyrannical power. The phrase hung, drawn, and quartered entered common usage as an exaggeration, used to describe someone who is in serious trouble or has been severely criticized. This casual usage, divorced from the reality of the punishment, ironically serves to keep the memory alive, even as it diminishes the horror. In literature and popular culture, the punishment has appeared countless times, from historical fiction to films like Braveheart, which depicted William Wallace's execution in graphic detail. These representations serve various purposes: entertainment, historical education, moral lessons about the abuse of power, or shock value. The question of whether such depictions are appropriate or whether they simply perpetuate fascination with extreme violence remains debated. What is clear is that hanging, drawing, and quartering occupies a unique place in the history of human cruelty, standing out even in an age when torture and brutal execution were commonplace. The sites of these executions have their own complex legacies. Tyburn, where so many met this fate, is now a quiet corner of London near Marble Arch. A small plaque marks the approximate location of the gallows, but few passers-by know the history beneath their feet. London Bridge no longer displays the heads of traitors, though the bridge has been rebuilt several times since those days. The Tower of London, where many prisoners were held before their execution, is now a tourist attraction where visitors can learn about the famous and infamous people who were imprisoned and died there. These transformations from sites of horror to sites of heritage raise uncomfortable questions about how we remember and commodify the past. Should these places be preserved as reminders of human cruelty, or should they be allowed to transform into something new, the blood washed away by centuries of rain and redevelopment? There is no easy answer, but the tension between remembering and forgetting shapes how we understand our own history and our own capacity for both justice and cruelty. The medical and physiological aspects of the punishment, examined through modern understanding, reveal even more clearly how calculated the cruelty was. The partial hanging caused hypoxia, starving the brain of oxygen and inducing a state of confusion and weakness, but not immediate unconsciousness. The cutting down, allowing air to return, would cause a surge of oxygen to the brain, potentially restoring some clarity even as the body went into shock. The emasculation would cause severe pain, but not rapid death, as there are no major organs in that area. The disembowelment, however, would begin to cause fatal injuries. Opening the peritoneal cavity would cause shock as the body reacted to the violation of its internal space. Pulling out intestines would cause extreme pain, as these organs are rich with nerve endings. Removing the stomach, liver, and other organs would eventually sever blood vessels large enough to cause fatal hemorrhaging, but this could take minutes rather than seconds. Modern understanding of shock, pain perception, and consciousness makes the horror even more acute, for we can now precisely map what the victim would have felt at each stage. Some victims might have lost consciousness quickly due to shock, their brains shutting down as a mercy. Others, particularly healthy young men in good physical condition, might have remained conscious far longer than we would wish to imagine. The question of when consciousness ends during such trauma has no certain answer. but the design of the punishment suggests the executioners believed their victims could witness much of their own destruction. The psychological torture of knowing one's fate deserves consideration as its own form of cruelty. Unlike a sudden execution or even a firing squad, where death comes quickly and perhaps unexpectedly, those sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered had days or weeks to contemplate their fate in detail. They knew exactly what would happen, had perhaps witnessed the execution of others, and could not escape the knowledge that they would soon experience the same. This anticipatory terror is recognized in modern psychology as a profound form of torture in itself. Some prisoners broke under this pressure, becoming incoherent or catatonic before their execution. Others found ways to cope through religion, philosophy, or simple denial. The night before execution was traditionally spent in prayer or final preparation, writing letters to loved ones or making peace with God. Some prisoners were defiant to the end, refusing to show fear or remorse. Others begged for mercy that would not come. The psychological resilience required to face this death with dignity is almost beyond comprehension. The famous cases of those who went to their deaths with courage, whether William Wallace refusing to plead or Catholic martyrs praying for their executioners, speak to extraordinary strength of will in the face of ultimate horror. The legal philosophy underlying this punishment reveals much about medieval and early modern concepts of justice. The idea was not simply retribution, but deterrence, not just punishment, but spectacle. The theory held that potential traitors, seeing the fate of those who had betrayed the crown, would think twice before acting on their own treasonous impulses. Whether this deterrence was effective is debatable. The punishment continued for centuries, suggesting either that it worked to some degree or that those in power believed it worked, which amounts to the same thing in practice. But treason continued despite the horrific punishment, suggesting that when people felt strongly enough about a cause, whether political, religious, or personal, the threat of even the most terrible death was not sufficient to stop them. This challenges the deterrence theory at its core. Perhaps the punishment persisted, not because it prevented treason, but because it served other purposes: revenge, the demonstration of power, the satisfaction of the crowd's bloodlust, or simply tradition. Once a punishment is established for centuries, it becomes difficult to change even if its effectiveness is questionable. To abolish hanging, drawing, and quartering might be seen as weakness, a softening of justice that traitors would exploit. Thus, the punishment perpetuated itself through institutional inertia as much as through any principled belief in its necessity. The international context of this punishment provides perspective on English justice. While hanging, drawing, and quartering was unique to the English system, other nations had their own spectacular executions for treason and other serious crimes. France had the breaking wheel, where victims were tied to a wagon wheel and had their limbs systematically broken with iron bars before being left to die. Germany had various forms of execution by boiling, burning, or being torn apart by horses. The Spanish Inquisition had its auto da fe, ritual burnings of heretics. The Ottoman Empire had impalement. Each culture developed its own methods of judicial killing that served similar purposes: punishment, deterrence, and the display of state power. In this context, hanging, drawing, and quartering was not aberrant, but typical of its time. It was part of a global pattern in which the human body became the canvas on which political power was written in pain and blood. The movement toward more humane execution methods in the 19th century, including the guillotine in France and the gradual adoption of hanging by long drop in England, reflected changing attitudes across Western civilization. The idea that execution should be swift and relatively painless, that the state could take life but should not inflict unnecessary suffering, marked a philosophical shift that would eventually lead to the modern abolition movement in many countries. The gender dimension of these punishments, mentioned earlier but worth exploring more deeply, reveals the complex intersection of justice, power, and social norms. Women convicted of high treason were burned at the stake rather than hanged, drawn, and quartered. The stated reason was public decency, the idea being that the exposure and mutilation of a woman's body would be inappropriate for public viewing. This reveals a society that was paradoxically concerned with propriety even in the midst of judicial murder. A woman could be burned alive, screaming as flames consumed her, but her body could not be cut open and displayed. The gendered nature of these punishments also reflected views about women's capacity for treason. Women were seen as less capable of the kind of deliberate political plotting that constituted high treason, and when they were convicted of such crimes, it was often as accomplices to men rather than as primary actors. The few women who were burned for treason, such as those involved in coining or in plots against the crown, became notable precisely because female traitors were relatively rare. The differential treatment of male and female bodies in execution reflects broader patterns in how gender, power, and violence intersected in early modern Europe. The role of the crowd in these executions cannot be overstated. This was not a private act but a public ceremony that required an audience to fulfill its purpose. The crowd was not merely passive observers, but active participants in the ritual. Their presence validated the state's justice, their reactions provided feedback on the execution's effectiveness, and their retelling of what they witnessed spread the message far beyond those who actually attended. The crowd could be fickle, however. A prisoner who died bravely could win their sympathy, turning the intended message of state power into a story of courage in the face of tyranny. A prisoner who begged or showed cowardice could become an object of ridicule, reinforcing the message that traitors were contemptible. The executioner had to manage the crowd's emotions as carefully as he managed the victim's body. If the execution was too quick, the crowd might feel cheated of spectacle. If it was too prolonged or if something went wrong, they might turn angry. There are accounts of crowds rioting when executions went badly, attacking the executioner or authorities. The crowd could also provide mercy in small ways, catching the quarters when the body was divided to give them proper burial against the state's wishes. The relationship between executioner, victim, and crowd was complex and dynamic, a triangle of power, suffering, and witness. The documentation of these executions in contemporary sources provides a wealth of detail, but also raises questions about historical memory and bias. Many accounts come from official records, which naturally present the state's perspective and justify the punishment. Other accounts come from chroniclers and historians who may have had their own agendas. Catholic accounts of Catholic martyrs emphasize the victims' faith and courage, sometimes to the point of hagiography. Protestant accounts of the same events might present the victims as traitors who got what they deserved. Personal journals and letters from witnesses provide more individual perspectives, but may be colored by the writer's own experiences and prejudices. The challenge for modern historians is to sift through these various sources, recognizing their biases while extracting useful information. The consistency of certain details across multiple sources lends them credibility. The fact that both supporters and opponents of particular executions agree on the basic facts of how the punishment was carried out suggests those facts are reliable. But the interpretation of those facts, the meaning assigned to the suffering, varies dramatically depending on the source. Was hanging, drawing, and quartering a just punishment for heinous crimes, or was it barbaric tyranny? The answer depends on whom you ask and when they lived.